Good morning and welcome to the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers mini conference about compassionate relational care and animal-assisted intervention. We are so excited that you all are joining us, and I want to begin by acknowledging that I am in Mi'kma'ki. This is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Their inherent rights to this land were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy people signed with the British Crown from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between multiple nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers joins our members and our communities in the necessary labor of reconciliation. We are so grateful to live and work together as treaty people in Mi'kma'ki. Without action, acknowledgements are empty. Whether you are with us in Mi'kma'ki or joining us from elsewhere, please consider whose territory you're in, your relationship with that land, your relationships with the Indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live in that place. We invite you to reflect on how each of us, as individuals and as a collective body of social workers, can hold ourselves accountable to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here and across Turtle Island. Walalu, thank you all. And again, you are muted, but you're welcome to chat. And chatting is a great way to make connections with each other, share. Hopefully you are more interested in what we're sharing than my little example here on the screen, but just please pay attention. You can chat to everyone, or you can chat individually to some people. With that, our schedule for the day is from 11 till about 12:30. We're going to be doing the research presentation on animal-assisted interventions in practice contexts and as a potential field guide in and to alterity relations. And our speakers, Dr. Cassandra Hanrahan, as well as Amber Lee Bolton, and I will share a little more about them in a few moments, will be leading us in this exciting research presentation. We will have a break from 12:30 to 1. And then we're going to have a discussion, and we're going to break out into small groups and go deeper into some of the findings and themes of the research findings. And then at 2:15, we have an exciting service and advocacy panel looking at human-animal relations in policy, relationship, and practice. And service organizations, social workers, and advocates will discuss the implications of working in humanized spaces that include animals. While non-human animals, especially companion species, are a part of daily life and a key familial relationship for many, they are often not considered in health and policy. So each panel member will present on how their experience in organization is expanding community definitions of companion animal roles and human-animal interactions. I am so excited for this day. I've been looking forward to it for so long because I am excited to learn about this topic that is deeply personally meaningful to me. And I know that many of you have already messaged us with your own enthusiasm for this day. So again, like us on Facebook or Twitter, follow us on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to share the recording of today with friends and family who might not be able to attend. So Just a few words about our presenters and researchers. Dr. Cassandra Hanrahan is assistant professor in the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. Her PhD in Sociology and Equity Studies and her master's in social work combine to form a strong basis in social justice for both her scholarship and teaching philosophy. She teaches courses from a transdisciplinary perspective in the core areas of theoretical foundations in social policy in the BSW and MSW campus and distance education programs. Her primary interest is in the interrelatedness of human, other animal, and environmental health and welfare, and the dynamic relationships between all three that affirm our kinship and remind us of our place in the web of life. A related interest in spirituality is aimed at fostering an active awareness of our interconnections as the foundation of human compassion for all living beings, and as a pathway towards sustainable health practices and ecological stewardship. Prior to her appointment at Dalhousie, Dr. Hanrahan was an independent visual arts curator and programmer for film and media arts festivals for equity-seeking groups, a focus that developed out of her dissertation on the role of visual narrative production and reception in relation to empowerment and resilience. Through conference presentations, popular and academic publications, and experience creating original film and media arts programs for community groups, she has substantive experience in knowledge translation. Her curatorial work, combining her knowledge of critical social theories with community capacity building, includes Rendezvous with Madness, Canada's leading mental health film festival at Toronto's Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, a cornerstone of which was the facilitation of post-screening question and answers and symposiums with mental health service providers, consumers, advocates, and the general public. We're also very excited to have with us Amber Lee Bolton, who has worked on the Animal-Assisted Interventions in Nova Scotia project with Dr. Hanrahan since 2018. She is currently a doctoral student at the University of Calgary in the Department of Community Health Sciences, specializing in population and public health. Amber Lee's doctoral research, supervised by Dr. Melanie Rock, focuses on service responses to animal hoarding. Amber Lee attained her Master in Social Work from the University of Calgary, where she completed 2 practicums with Dr. Rock through the O'Brien Institute for Public Health and the Brenda Stafford Center on Aging. And with that, I am going to stop my screen share, and I am going to instead share the screen, the PowerPoint of our researchers who will be taking over. So I'm going to mute myself, and I am going to invite Amber Lee and Cassandra to both begin the presentation as I spotlight them.
Thanks, Anne. Wonderful to be here. I want to express my gratitude for your presence this morning, to appreciate our common humanity, the shared earth, all those who live here now, who have lived here, and who will live here in the future. So next slide. Am I the one to do that, Anne? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you. Okay. I'm using 2 screens. So I just want to say quickly then a few words about me before we launch into it, this, and Amberly too for a further introduction. I'll quickly say that I am a professor, I'm an associate professor at the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. I'm also a mother. I have 2 young children, twins, a boy and a girl, and I'm the keeper of a 4-legged new member of the family named Capito. And here there are some photos of Amberly and I. different families. Mine are older, but I like them, so I decided to use them. But these are of my children and of our dog at the time, and essentially my web, my life. And I share these pictures because like those other people working in human-animal relations within the behavioral and social sciences, including, of course, those who do animal-assisted interventions. I share these pictures because they are my lived experiences and of relations with companion animals, and that have inspired my work in this area. So and to me, they speak to the power and resilience of human-animal relations and the benefits that we can accrue through close associations. And I'm really happy to be here today to talk with you about my research and to listen to you and to your ideas. And also later after lunch about the innovative programs that are happening in Canada. So thank you again. Just off the top, I do want to say a very special thank you to N and the Nova Scotia College of Social Work for hosting this event. It really has been a long time coming. And so in some ways, so I thank you all for your patience. And I'm saying this to the study participants, I'm hoping some of whom will be here today. There was a lag between when the research was conducted into not this final, but to this moment of sharing with you all. And though it seems perfect in some ways, because I think that we are at a historical moment where this information, I think, is there's more of a readiness to receive it. So I do thank the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers and in particular for Anne's enthusiasm in wanting to hear these conversations and creating this platform. Also a special thank you to Amber Lee for doing this work with me, and just really enjoy working with you. So Amber Lee.
Oh, thank you, Cassandra. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to see many familiar faces and to draw in lots of lovely team members from across the country, and also see some of the participants and put faces to names for all these wonderful interviews that I've heard and listened to for so many years. For me, I'm hailing from Ulnu Mi'kma'ki territory in Antigonish County, and I have a small farm out here that hosts many different critters and has become such a part of enjoying my human-animal relations work that came about through my master's a number of years ago, and has just been such an eye-opening and wonderful experience to enjoy the world that much more, and to see the world for another dimension of what we have in our homes and what we interact with in our work and in our policies. So a little bit about myself is I'm currently hosting 3 cats in my home that generally like to stay inside more than go outside, but all have found various new beds that my infant isn't occupying at the moment, as you can see in one of the pictures there with the little swing. And in the other photo there is one of the other cats. And I think it's just great calling out for some attention in the garden as we're managing the various outdoor activities that we do in the summer. So again, just really excited to be part of this research and see all the wonderful connections that continue to happen as we understand the impact that animal companions and interacting with animals in our world means, and very excited to continue on with this presentation.
So there are many acknowledgements, but also off the top, sending thank yous to the research assistants that helped in the various stages of this research. So Rebecca Shuluk, Julia Wasef, and also to Dr. Atsuko Matsuka at the School of Social Work at York, who gave feedback on the interview questionnaires, and as I mentioned, the college. and to all the study participants, but we'll get there. Just a quick note, but that tomorrow, April 30th, is the National Therapy Animal Day. So that's maybe of interest to some. Next slide. So a brief agenda for this next hour is that we'll start with a brief summary of animal-assisted interventions and what the impetus for this particular research inquiry into animal-assisted interventions in the province. And then we'll move into a discussion of the actual research, the purpose and the process, about the methodology, and of course the findings, and we'll end with some future implications for practice. So just again want to acknowledge that this research was funded by Research Nova Scotia, that was formerly called Nova Scotia Health Research Foundation. So thank you very much for funding this work. Next slide. So so we're going to talk about the purpose of this research. So starting at the beginning. And so essentially, this research was to explore the provision of animal-assisted interventions in Nova Scotia from practitioners' perspectives to better understand how animal-assisted interventions are organized within the broader context of health and mental health service delivery within the province. So our overarching, our aim was to explore the findings to strengthen AAI services. Oh, no, we'll stay on that slide for a minute. Yeah, so despite the growing body of animal-assisted, research in the field of animal-assisted relations, there remain significant gaps in how the health professions, including social work, respond to practice issues. So we know that AAI are being done nonetheless in Canada, but there are very few opportunities for further educational development and training in AAI as a specialization. So it led to this wanting to look into what was actually going on. There were a number of empirical investigations in North America that laid a sort of the groundwork or a baseline for getting a sense that there was a tremendous amount of interest. There were some things going on in terms of social workers' knowledge of human-animal interactions and bonds. But again, that there was a tremendous gap in available resources for educational opportunities and training. So, and also among those earlier findings was the consistent finding that companion animals were ubiquitous in communities and in family systems, that there were a number of therapeutic benefits, and also the links between animal cruelty and other forms of human violence. So we using that earlier research, we had the idea that with that earlier research, along with the idea that the welfare of non-human animals and the health of the natural environment are linked and also connected to the well-being of humans, we decided, sorry, I just need to pause one sec. There's some background noise, hang on. Okay, sorry about that, I'm back. So just quickly then, the idea that the welfare of animals and the health of the environment are connected to the well-being of people is not a new idea. There was the previous research on this. But in a world today of entangled and intensifying global pressures and local tensions, we argue that in order for social work and animal-assisted interventions to be relevant, to be efficacious, that these areas must address the animal question or animal questions and shift from an anthrocentric to an ecocentric lens. So now next slide. So here we just compiled a list of, and this is not, this is a very truncated list, but just to give you a sense of some of the things going on in the area of animal-assisted relations and animal-assisted interventions, human relations and animal-assisted interventions. There are many, many different organizations and groups, conferences, research institutes, think tanks, all across the world, really. We've just showed a small portion of them here, but to give you a sense of what's going on, and then we're going to talk about Nova Scotia. Okay. So the majority of AAI education, support, and services comprise what we discovered are elective, self-regulated, and in some cases unregulated private sector non-profit organizations. And while these organizations that train, evaluate, and register therapy animals and offer AAI, like Pet Partners in the US and Therapy Dogs International, while these organizations have proliferated in the US, there are far fewer in Canada. And there are no organizations, in fact, that spanned across the country to create a cohesive sort of national reach. So so even though we have international organizations like the International Association of Human-Animal Interaction Organizations, and while those are accessible online, or if you travel to the States or to Europe for training, we don't have any corresponding branches in Canada that can extend credentialization. So in the absence of what some have called an animal therapy industry in Canada, that is dedicated to things like quality assurance, and I put that in air quotes because of the language, I think is a bit problematic. But in the absence of this type of industry that is dedicated to quality assurance in the practice of AAI and the promotion of AAI, and offering, the promotion of official recognition as a valid therapeutic and pedagogical form of intervention, the existing AAI organizations in Canada don't extend past their local reach as broad spectrum leaders. Next slide. So the next two slides are a little bit out of order, but we wanted to put them here at the top just to show the training backgrounds of the research participants, who we'll talk more about in a few moments, but who were divided into two categories, those considered as volunteers, and then another set considered professionals because they had health professional education backgrounds. And so just to show you a little bit, in this slide here, we have the volunteer. So these are the types of training that those who participated in the study had at the beginning. So you can see the different organizations listed there. Next slide. And this group, the professional, were coming with backgrounds in psychology, registered counseling and social work and recreation therapy and so on. So that is to say that the various participants who we interviewed who conduct AAI are located in their professional domains, but with the volunteer ones, if we just want to go back to that slide for a minute, you can see there that there's a different independent organizations, some with national reach, but then limited educational programming, like St. John Ambulance. Okay, well, we can get more into that later. If you want to skip ahead and to the next, yes. So, Amberly, did you want to say something? Yeah, so we just wanted to say a few things about AAI organizations in Canada compared to what we were just talking about in North America and internationally.
Great, thanks, Cassandra. So again, we just wanted to highlight some of the different certification programs that our participants had mentioned that they'd been part of, and really there was quite a high complement and what's the word I'm trying to think of, and a lot of praise for the equine assisted therapy certifications that are out there, and anyone that was involved in equine assisted therapeutic work has taken one of the training methods that we've mentioned here, and these are available in Canada. But what we found is that, and we'll get more into this later too, is that even though they do have broad spectrum cover across Canada as far as an organization, they might not necessarily have the reach into rural regions per se. So even as they do kind of have a national standard, there's still different methods in and of themselves and mandates and reach for each of them in and of themselves. And I'd say the same thing with the canine assisted therapeutic certifications, which definitely in the States has significantly more different organizations that are under it, that and certainly kind of within anybody's own locales, there's quite a few that you could do just with any kind of dog training, but really the only ones that seem to come up consistently that again have a broad reach across Canada and really do have a set regulatory mandate that's recognized as a big voice were these two. So like we said, this isn't a list, and we welcome any feedback if anybody knows of more, but these were certainly the ones that came up from our participant experience and as we were doing the literature review. So really very interesting to see that as Canada, this grows in popularity, that Canada is not quite the leader yet, where we see other places like England and Australia and the United States going with these. Did you want to say something first, Cassandra?
No, so we're now from this, so looking at the context, we're going to talk the next few slides about some definitions, and Amberly will begin with the first few, and then we'll continue from there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these definitions, but as we also found out, and what was also very interesting about the research from where it started even till now, is that these definitions around animal-assisted intervention remain fairly ambiguous, and it's only been within the last number of years that there have been publications to really bring these together and to kind of say that these will be the umbrella terms that we're using for each of these therapies. So the definition of animal-assisted intervention has had as many as 20 different definitions and 12 different terms within the last 20 years, I think. And the general understanding of differences in AAI terms with terminology for services and animals and AAI being used interchangeably is continuing to happen. There was a white paper that was published by the International Association of Human Animal
Intervention organizations.
Thank you. I looked at the big long thing and lost it. So that's been very helpful, and certainly Aubrey Fine's textbooks that he and his co-editors have been continuing to publish over the last number of years has been able to do this. But the vernacular is still pretty largely unregulated, and we find that, as you'll see later on, as we're going through the definitions, that there really is quite a bit of confusion still between what is a therapy animal, what is a service animal, what is an emotional support animal, what kind of therapy we're giving. So another note that I wanted to say is our interviews in the original research use the terminology from Pet Partners, which was the most current at the time. And as we were writing our research and coming back to it, the IAHIO white paper came out to define these practices. So it was even as we were doing the research that some of this started to become more cohesive, which was really quite interesting. I'm just looking to see, great. And so again, these are just, as you can see on the slides, these are just going into some of the more definitions about what types of therapies we have and what the goals are. So animal-assisted intervention overall is the overall umbrella, and that's particularly what we referred to in our papers and in this presentation. We'll just refer to AAI because getting into some of the nitpicky details around what some of this is, and even with some of the ambiguities that still continue in visitations and training and everything, we wanted to be able to be more inclusive for what people are doing, as opposed to trying to insert way too many acronyms. So I hope you can see from the slides here that these are some of the other activities and education levels and the different types of training and the different types of goals that are involved with that. Thank you, Anne. And then the last slide here that we wanted to highlight as far as the key definitions is around the service animals. So service dogs were not included in this study as they contribute to a different category than the companion animals who participate in AAI. But we did want to include the definition here because of the ongoing confusion in terms. And even as we talk about it sometimes, I know even you and I in conversation sometimes, Cassandra, like interchangeably use it just because it's so part of the vernacular sometimes that it's really a consciousness piece in that. So one of the study participants actually talks about this, and that the ambiguity, and we'll get into this again later, when they were trying to get insurance on an office, said, I actually did ask the agent mediating when I signed the lease. And she said, don't even ask. They'll think you're crazy. And this is around having a therapy dog in the office space. It's standard in buildings, public buildings, unless it's a therapy dog. So this is what the mediator said. And the person responded, I said, this is a therapy dog. And she said, no, you know what I mean, a service dog. And one of the other participants, and it came up quite frequently, and another quote was just, people tend to approach therapy and service dogs interchangeably. So I think many of us have seen this too, as far as how to mediate interaction with service dogs as well, just in public. So notably, the proliferation of types of support received from companion animals by people has only further increased the ambiguity regarding terminology. In 2016, Nova Scotia recently reviewed and updated its service dog legislation because of some of this ambiguity, and because, as we know in different pieces, and I know in Calgary, the idea of a chicken as an emotional support animal has come up. So what does that mean, and what do these kind of animals look like? So again, what we're saying is these haven't been part of our study here, but they're an important part of the conversation as we continue on. Thank you.
Thanks, Amberly. So in the next few slides, I want to say a few words about the terminology that we used in our write-ups. And we can see from just what Amberly was saying about the core terms around the different types of animal-assisted interventions, that the refinement of terminology and attention to greater accuracy and consistency across usages is so important. And it really has been a focus of those in this field. It just took a while to come together, but it does increase accountability. It edifies individual and organizational development and facilitates public understanding, because you can see from those two quotes that Amberly just read that there remains some confusion in public understanding. But overall, in general, attention to terminology does strengthen research as well, and the overall development of the field. So to these aims, we conscientiously refer to the relationships between people and other animals in terms of companionship, peaceful coexistence, and ethical relationality. So that's those are some of the words that we use. Regarding the second bullet there, we also recognize that the common distinction between people and other animals is a false dichotomy, propping up a humanist taxonomy that ultimately naturalizes what we call speciesism and human privilege. And so what this is to say that the humanism prioritizes the human, but we point out not all people. So it prioritizes the human over non-human beings with a kind of superiority status, and resulting in a demeaning or objectification of other animals. So we see this represented in idioms like pet ownership, and handler. These pervade common vernacular still in AAI lexicon. So we try to do a conscientious shift away from those words and use words like companion animal, non-human animal, other animal, and also just animal for brevity. Oh, no, back, please. So in deference to animal agency as well, and multi-species relationships, and respect for the emotional and physical labor of that animals contribute in AAI practices, we use those terms, but also trying to encourage a shift away from pet. Sorry, I have so many notes here, but it represents essentially an ideological move away from the commoditization or the perceptions of non-human animals as possessions and also as resources, towards a view that prioritizes animal agency across and among species. In terms of the human-animal bond, this is language that's still in use, but there has been a recent shift in the last several years to human-animal interactions, sort of more as an umbrella term. So human-animal interactions can be both negative and positive. And then even more recently, there's been a shift from human-animal interactions to human-animal relations. And then finally on this list, you see the word zooia, and we do use this in our work, and it's essentially the inverse of zoonosis, and it constitutes, according to Hodgson and Darling, who in their 2011 paper really brought the term to the fore to represent the positive benefits, the positive experiences and outcomes of human-animal relations. And it, as they write, constitutes the evidence base for the philosophical construct of what was hitherto known as human-animal bonds, human-animal relations. Okay, next slide. So this is a big term, and it's sort of embedded. It's this part of our work, and I think it bears explaining because while it may be very familiar for some, it isn't for others. And it's a pivotal term in our work, or in this field, I should say. So there are many definitions of anthropocentrism that are out there. I prefer this one by David Nyberts. It's a 2003 definition because it highlights anthropocentrism or human centrism as an ideological configuration that, and it denaturalizes it. So I'll read the first paragraph, but then leave it there for you to refer going forward. But it essentially is an ideological conditioning. Actually, I'm not going to read it because we have a lot to move through, but basically it is, shall I read it or should we not read slides? What do you think, Amberly?
I think I just noticed that I knocked out the T in anthropocentrism or the H in it. So
H, and I see a couple of typos, but well, okay. So ideological conditioning is the third essential requirement for oppressive social arrangements. Oppression requires rationalization and legitimation. It must appear as the right thing to do, both to the oppressing group and in the eyes of others. A set of ideas that devalues an entire group, an ideology such as racism, sexism, or speciesism, thus is socially constructed. That ideology explains and supports the development and perpetuation of social institutions that foster the elimination or exploitation of the oppressed group. So I'm glad I read that out because as we go forward, what we are talking about here today is the field of animal-assisted interventions. And I'm jumping way ahead, but one of the key findings is that, the absence of this conceptual language, and we make a case for it to be integrated. Okay, next slide. So a few words then about our methodology. The research about human-animal relations and the benefits of animal-assisted interventions with populations across the life course has been growing since the 1960s. In fact, some, like Irvine and Celia, have suggested, along with others, that the way people value and regard animals in general, and animal companions in particular, has changed in the last half century, with a move away from anthropocentrism, that is the assumption of human ascendancy, to zoocentrism, the recognition of animals as full or partial subjects. And while this is true and much welcome, we argue that our everyday language and other systems of representation remain anthropocentric. So it makes it, it poses particular issues in research about and involving animals, and it makes it difficult for just for the average person to talk about their relationships, their relations with other animals in ways, because the language is typically reserved for people. So this is something that we encountered in doing the interviews and in transcribing them. And we'll talk about that. That will surface in a few moments. So in order to do justice then to the spirit of what we knew was happening in AAI activities, that is to say, you know, the tremendous passion and care and attention and love that is experienced and felt for companion animals with those doing AAI services. So in order to do justice to that work, and at the same time to address the critiques of instrumentalization among animal-assisted interventions or animals as tools, you know, to unpack some of the contradictions, you know, why some animals and not others that ultimately do limit the field when left undressed, we needed to not only a critical lens, but a creative paradigm to foster and incorporate a critique of humanism, which is the very foundation of most meaning making, certainly in the academy and in sciences and so on. So you can see on the slide then that if you want to just go back one end, please. Well, I guess not. Okay. So anyway, our hope then in choosing posthumanism rather, is that the insights gained through the research would contribute to a much broad, so not only help develop the field of animal-assisted interventions, but also contribute to a much broader discussion about otherness, essentially, in order to highlight what we think is an imperative to re-examine and ultimately ethicize human other animal interactions, not just in animal-assisted interventions, but at large. So the posthumanism that framed the posthumanism that framed our research most resembles the understanding that was put forward by Rosie Braidotti. And she writes that the post-human predicament is the convergence of posthumanism on the one hand and post-anthropocentrism on the other. The former focuses on the critique of the humanist ideal of man as the allegedly universal meaning of measure of all things, while the latter criticizes species and human exceptionalism. And Braidotti argues that the post-human constitutes a transdisciplinary field, moreover, a field of scholarship, and that it's more than just the sum of its parts. And it points to a qualitative leap towards the construction of different knowing subjects, different subjects of knowledge, and I add knowing subjects. So I think in many ways it's a perfect paradigm to do this work, to push the field of animal-assisted interventions a little further. So next slide. And here we're going to talk a little bit about the methods used in talking with those practicing animal-assisted interventions in Nova Scotia. So I'll leave it to Amber Lee. Great.
So the methodology chosen for this study was constructive grounded theory, and it really did reflect some of the previous studies that we had seen. In particular, Cassandra had observed with Christina Reesley Curtis in the States, who was really going and speaking to people about their companion animals and the experiences that they had. And what we're seeing more, and what the research has even said in the last number of years, is that AAI research has been quite survey heavy, or quite heavy in different specific communities where they can look at it in a specific environment that's very easy to measure. And so it was very exciting to take the idea of constructed grounded theory, which is very iterative. It explores a lot of themes through people's stories and people discussing their lives and their experiences to understand where the research was coming from and to be able to make these grander connections through these stories. So we'll show you the slide later on, but we had almost 40 interviews over the whole piece and got this incredibly broad spectrum of the experiences of all of these AAI practitioners across Nova Scotia. And so the last part I'll say is that Sharmaz has written a number of books on constructive grounded theory, which she began and purported. And part of that, and what you'll see is some of our best practices, is really making sure that the work has as these four components say, the originality, credibility, resonance with the people reading it and the researchers, and usefulness toward what we're going towards. So we just wanted to kind of give you broad strokes on why we decided to go with that specific method.
Next slide. And as part of our methods of collecting data and then the analysis of that data is what I've called animal-informed theory, and it written in the context of social work, but I think can certainly apply in the subspecialty of animal-assisted interventions. Essentially, it's a lens, it's a perspective, it's a worldview that encompasses and expands on anti-oppressive social work theory practice by addressing and incorporating human privilege and anthropocentrism, and also centering sustainability as a core value, which it currently is not. So it's an emergent perspective, but I believe it's highly relevant in today's rapidly changing world, wherein theoretical frameworks are just simply inadequate for students in animal welfare related placements. It's at its core, we'll just stay on that slide for a minute. At its core, it understands humans to be part of the rest of the planet. It informed our listening during the interviews and also the analysis of the data. Yeah, okay, next slide. So as Amberly just said, we had a number of interested parties who were invited to do 60-minute semi-structured interviews that consisted of 41 questions that were divided thematically into 6 sections. And we were really interested to hear the beginning, how is it that you started working with animals in your practice, whether that was a health-related practice or in a volunteer activity? What led you to this work? The second category is the actual work, like working with people and in AAI within the broader health-related landscape. So there we did ask, I'm jumping ahead. The third category is that of organizational context. So what were some of the policies, standards of practice, a code of ethics that were being used to conduct the animal-assisted interventions. We also asked about educational and training background. And then at the end, we did ask people's attitudes towards non-human animals before wrapping up. Next slide. I'll let Amberly take this.
Great, thanks, Cassandra. So another few pieces we wanted to highlight here, and what constructive grounded theory works with around narrative, is that there really isn't, you don't go in and they say with a priori knowledge, so an expectation of what you're going to hear and what you want in it. And so we really wanted to highlight that that wasn't part of what determined the interviews. But the interesting thing about this, because it is still such an emergent field, is we have to say that after the interviews were conducted, there was a literature review made about the concepts that we could expand on, and you see the different definitions. So just to really have a grounding in understandings of anthropocentrism, zooia, and saltogenesis, which I have the definition for, but I'm sitting with right now, Cassandra, because I've heard it and I should know it off the top of my head. Can you give me the piece on what I'm losing right now with it?
Well, it's basically the origins of the origins of health and health practices. So there's some literature on the grounding of interactions with the more than human world, including natural spaces, is is a starting place, is an organic place for healthier living and for well-being.
Lovely. Thank you. Yes. So really working into that post-human emphasis. And I think you did such a great job of bringing so many pieces of that knowledge to me, even as I was emerging and coming into the field too. So that's really why we wanted to have the literature review there, working alongside what we were understanding about what we had received. And so a few of the best practice pieces that we had, and what I can highlight here is that we did do simultaneous data collection and analysis. And as you can see, it was member checked by Cassandra all the way along. And then there were 3 different research assistants in the process at different points that were also doing memoing and 2-step coding through NVivo as well. And as we all know and love NVivo, I always like to say through, because it reminds us that someone still is doing all that coding themselves in there and looking at each of these pieces. So from there, we took in, again, just different meetings and different memoing to be able to continue to bring out the larger themes and really have a consensus on what that looked like. And so that was quite a long process. And I'm just making sure I'm not missing any of the best practice piece here in my notes about it, but we really did have that grounded by the time the paper was written. And there was a notes review written as well about that continued to be another document source we went back to. And did you want to say something, Cassandra?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I think after this slide, I'll just quickly review the next and then to get to our findings in the interest of time.
Great.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lovely note from Melanie there too, which is always so exciting about, yes, all the connections that we can make as social workers, which is one of my favorite things to do as well. So just to really highlight this and who came forward, this was all voluntary through snowball sampling and through recruitment on a Facebook page and a website that Cassandra had established with another one of the research assistants. We had 21 volunteers and 15 professionals come forward to be interviewed. As you can see, and what was important for us to delineate is that the professionals that came forward and that we were able to identify were people that were receiving remuneration for the therapy and for the AAI that they were conducting, where volunteers were volunteering their time and being present for it. So there was a difference in what those looked like that you'll see. And the other piece that we really wanted to highlight, and that I think may feel somewhat self-evident to some, is that dogs comprised the majority of the cases of AAI, with horses comprising the other 25% of AAI practice. Generally, the other animals that we see, and there were other ones mentioned that were quite lovely and had some great anecdotes, were cats, goats, lizards. You've seen a few calves in there. And I wanted to say that also a few pieces on the demographics for the participants is they ranged in age between 26 to 70 years of age. 30 participants were female identified, comprising 84% of the total population of our group. 6 participants identified as male, representing approximately 16%. And in all of the interviews, no one self-identified with genders other than binary genders of male, female at the time. And all participants identified as Caucasian, apart from one person who identified as being Irish, French, and Indigenous. So that's kind of a bigger spectrum too. And, we don't have time to explore those demographics in this study, but an interesting piece as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Amberly. So I'm just we have a series of charts, but I'm really going to refer to them quite briefly because I want to dig into the findings in the interest of time. But I will just say quickly though about what Amberly was saying about the participants, that the division that we made between volunteer and professional, we did use 2 slightly questionnaire guides. Very similar, slightly different, but in a way, as the research went on, I felt very uncomfortable with the categorizations, because it was clear to me that everyone doing animal assisted intervention was a professional in their own right, in the sense that many, so it was just hard. I became aware that maybe there was a sense that the volunteers were not professional, or or the professionals weren't doing more than sort of above and beyond their professional workload, that there were many volunteer and extra hours put in. So those in some sense felt a little bit arbitrary, but for the purposes of the research and for just categorizing, it was really strictly professionals were people who had health professional education, and getting, and being paid for that work. And so then we're doing AAI as a subspecialty, and volunteers were people whose paid work had nothing really to do with their AAI, and they were volunteering primarily in animal assisted activities. So I think that's important to know. And one other note that as Amberly was speaking that came to mind. Oh, and just, yes, no surprise there that the majority were identified as women. I mean, that is, we know that the field of AAI is what's the phrase? Anyway, there's more women involved, but that I don't have the current data on that, but that could be changing. Okay, so the next few slides are just breakdowns of, you can see in the first one, or if we just go back, so the population that the participants were working with, you can see it's the whole spectrum. So from, adults, children, families, seniors, university students, veterans, women, so on, and first responders, and so on and so forth. You can see that, next slide, please, that they were dealing with, working with people who experiencing many different symptoms rather, so anxiety, trauma, mental health, and so on and so forth. Next slide. And that the primary settings that people were working in included private practice, inpatient mental health, outpatient health, college and university. Next slide. And that the settings were also varied as expected, as is the reality, from stable environments right through to schools, to hospital settings, and so on. Next slide. And the primary training backgrounds for people who were working as volunteers was also varied, but sort of the whole gamut. So that's okay. We'll go back. We'll go to findings now. So while and so I do want to. I'm hoping that we won't race through this, but while ideas, we know that the ideas about non-human animals within the general public and AAI are changing and evolving. I think just the number of stories in popular media that have been on the increase signifies that. And just, of course, the burgeoning and exploding domains in academia and just in the field of animal-human interactions is exploding. And so we know that the ideas about animals are changing, but there still remains a dearth of empirical investigation in this field, in the field of animal-assisted interventions. So as such, our overarching aim of the analysis was to explore the changing and evolving views of companion animals away from tools and property to sentient partners within AAI practice, and from practitioner perspectives. So we really focused our analysis, and the first find, it speaks to this, all of the findings do, but the first finding, I think, speaks to this very, very clearly, is that, so we really wanted to get at the inter and intra-relational dynamics of animal-assisted interventions in Nova Scotia. So you can see here that the first finding is, if you want to just go back to the first slide, go back one, yeah. So quickly, that we learned that AAI entry point is personally motivated, and that AAI dyads are highly relational and intuitive. That practitioner initiative is central to continuance and development, and that the AAI theoretical frameworks, competencies, ethics, and standards of practice are eclectic, and that attitudes towards animals involve limited ideas about justice and animal justice, animal rights. And two, that settings and contexts of animal-assisted interventions are significant in how those practices are ultimately delivered and received by clients. And we discovered some interesting, learned some interesting ideas around information around animal agency in therapeutic spaces. So just speaking then to the first finding, nearly all the study participants, that's like 91%, identified a revelatory event through which they realized that the therapeutic dynamics of human-animal interactions. In this way, participants discussed beginning AAI in a way accidentally. The preceding pathways from initial human-animal relations or experiences to developing an AAI practice were, however, informed through considerable reflection. And that was quite impressive in speaking to participants, just the amount of passion and reflection that led from sort of the revelatory experiences in one's life to wanting to do this professionally. All participants shared initiation stories in relation to a current or former animal companion. And these stories ranged from experiences with animals during a personally difficult time to witnessing how an animal responded to another individual's emotional state. For example, one participant told us that people didn't realize what was happening because they thought he was just being friendly, but he went to every person that was in trouble, every person he would go in to see. It took him 2 seconds to clear that away. Sorry, every person that he would go in to see, it would take him a few seconds to clear that away. 53% of participants said they recognized that in their animal companion an ability to attune to people around them or to sense and connect to the emotive states of others, which was coded as empathy. And 86% spoke to the positive emotional connections people made with animals in practice. So on the screen here, there's some lovely quotes, and I'll just read the first one. I first started understanding the therapeutic benefits animals could offer humans when I was 11. That was because my father died very unexpectedly. I don't think I would have made it through that time in my life if I didn't have the animals. They filled something in me that people had never fulfilled. So you can see that's pretty impactful. And the second one is, she was on top of my night terrors, waking me up when they started. Now, rather than waking up to those, I get woken up with a gentle nudge from a wet nose. It's a lot easier to stare at big brown eyes attached to some floppy ears than it is to deal with what I was dealing with before. So these were the types of stories that we were hearing about what led people into wanting to do more animal-assisted interventions, either on a volunteer basis or to develop it as a subspecialty within their professional health practice. Next slide. Yes. So animal partners. So the way that AI developed was there was generally two pathways. One was that animal partners were brought into existing therapeutic practice. So one participant told us that I had to bring him to work every day, and serendipitously discovered he was a great adjunct to the work I was doing with clients. And then the other pathway was therapeutic services for people. Were developed. Therapeutic services for people were developed into activities with animals after experiencing Zoea. And that pathway was often manifested in the form of partnerships. So there may be a stable of horses, and that person would, who had a tremendous knowledge of horsemanship, and how to be around horses, and riding and all the things that people with horses do, and bringing in someone with a counseling background. And so developing a program from there. So those were the two general pathways that were taken in developing AAI services and programs. And although participants conceptualized the care of animal companions in, so that was so we'll go to next slide. Thank you. So the next is that AAI practitioner initiative was found to be central to continuing and development of the service and program. The development of AAI in a milieu marked by an absence of specialized programs and an absence of general infrastructure really underscored for us practitioner and client convictions in the restorative power of ZUIA, that is the positive effects and dynamics of human-animal interactions. Participants spoke passionately regarding the integration of animal-assisted interventions into organizational programming. So I'll just look at the first quote here. When we introduced this program, said one participant, I said straight up, my goal is that dogs will be supporting victims of crime in the courtroom setting. We're getting ready to meet with judges to ask them, how can we make this happen? I made a list of horrible things, horrible things that could really possibly happen. And as long as we had a mitigation strategy for each one of those things, no one's been able to argue with it, especially in a hospital setting. Another participant said to us, bringing a dog in just shifts their idea of what psychology can be, what the psychologists may do. It doesn't fit with what the media has shown them. So what we took away from this was that the study participants were unwavering in their belief in the potential of animal-assisted interventions to positively affect people's physical and mental health and well-being. Still, though, there was a gap in training. So the substantial interest in human-animal bonds, human-animal relations by health practitioners was unheeded, and continues to be unheeded by a gap in education and training curricula. So the next slide. In the current study, practitioners' personal relationships with individual companions in practice were perceived by all as a pivotal nexus or a revelatory experience that informed their therapeutic work, that strengthened the therapeutic alliance between themselves and the clients they worked with, and mitigated the animal partner's stress and needs. And although participants didn't cite specific standards of practice or theoretical frameworks that were specific to AAI, all participants variously reported how those relationships enabled them to recognize and to attend to the therapeutic dynamics of the work with clients and the needs of their companion animals. Participants in general reported that they did not receive AAI specific education, specialized training, or mentorship, and were generally not networked with other AAI practitioners. Some were to an extent, but informally. The median age was 50 to 65. And so you can see that most had completed their education several years ago, even decades ago. Then as now, relatively few disciplines acknowledged the relational significance of animals to human health and well-being. Yes. One participant said, if only, it's really only been the last 10 years that there's been a focus on animal abuse and things like that. Sorry, just something's happened with my computer. Okay, next slide, please. So without hesitation, though, all study participants described animal companions as family members, with the majority of participants currently living with one or more animal. And as you can see from the slide, one said, we're the typical middle-aged children all over the house couple that gets 2 fluffy dogs and they're like new babies. So at times we did hear this kind of anthropomorphized filial attachment, but it was simultaneously positioned or merged with a discourse of we heard this kind of anthropomorphized filial attachments that merged with a kind of discourse of ownership and control, perhaps. But it came with counter stories as well of animals' autonomous disposition and perception. So there was a really kind of interesting mixing of sentiment and emotion. And I think that has a lot to do with the language that's available to us to describe these kinds of unique multi-species relationships and experiences and families. And they further reveal how relationships with animals, people's lived experiences with them, are phenomenological, and that they precede the cultural mores and institutions. And as such, they're shaped contradictorily in messy intersections of private and public, individual and systemic. They definitely show an appreciation of Zuia that was found to be a central motivating factor for practitioners' pursuit of AAI and in shoring up their resilience within the field. That is largely, in Canada anyway, self-directed, and it requires a lot of stamina, a lot of perseverance, a lot of commitment on the part of those doing the work, just due to lack of infrastructure. Next slide. So the next slide was, we asked people about the standards of go back one, just the standards of practice that were in place, and competencies, any code of ethics in place that were specific to the AAI work that they were doing. And this was found to be eclectic, that there were that no one was really using an animal interventions, an animal assisted intervention specific theoretical framework. And to be fair, none really exists. There isn't an animal assisted interventions code of ethics, or an animal informed code of ethics, if you will, though one has been suggested by Thomas Wright, by a social work researcher in Australia. So you can see here that most then were using what was already in place from within their, if they were working if they were health professionals, that they were so already in place for their profession. Okay, next slide. So while justice for animals and animal-assisted animal partner rights are not regulated, participants were well aware of their animals' sensitivities and needs as working companions. So in conversation, this appeared sometimes as anthropomorphizing of their animal companion needs. But as I say, I think it has to do with that we really pinpointed the lack of available language to describe those experiences. So one participant said, "I struggled with it ethically sometimes. F is my partner, but he doesn't really have a voice. His voice is nonverbal. It's in his body language. So I had to be very careful about staying in tune with his body language." I'm just looking ahead here. Okay. Okay, so next slide then. So I guess I feel like I made a bit of a jump in my mind, and maybe it's in my notes, but so due to the lack of a theoretical framework that's AAI specific, or code of ethics, if you will, that there is a tension, and there has been that the default becomes then those that are currently in place, which are anthropocentric, and that they're geared towards working specifically with human clients, and none that incorporate a kind of triangulation of animal, human client, human practitioner. And so sometimes then what we did discover is that often that the priority and attention is placed on the welfare and well-being of the person, of the human client. And so but nonetheless, we, in that slide that we were in the notes that I was just saying, that people were aware of animal sensitivities in practice. So, and during the time of this research, a significant contribution has been made to the field, where there are, sorry, I'm in my notes here. Yes, significant contributions have been made to the field that have helped to formalize AAI theory and practice. And and one particular contribution came out in 2015, which was just after and coinciding with the time that we were conducting the interviews. And this is a collaboration. So this is a competency, AAI competencies. And it was a collaboration with the Animal Assisted Therapy in Mental Health Interest Network of the American Counseling Association. And it introduced an unprecedented theoretical framework describing competencies to be used in animal assisted therapies in counseling. But generally, the lack of reference to this emergent, and as I say, it did come out in the midst of the study, so it wouldn't have been known, it wasn't known popularly, but there was a general lack of reference to this emergent AAI specific theory and practice knowledge among study participants, which is not surprising, as I say, due to the fact that it was so new, but also to the absence, more importantly, of an AAI culture or infrastructure that's supported and fostered by specialized programs in post-secondary educational institutions, for instance, and by professional associations. Yeah, okay, and next slide. And the fourth finding that I want to talk about before turning it over is this one where we ask questions about attitudes towards animals. And we learned that in general, there was a limited set of ideas about animal justice. And we know at the same time that animal welfare is an essential component of AAI design. And that has only relatively been introduced. I mean, there has been a shift from the early language in the 60s from tools. Even today, though, we hear the way the phrasing of animals are used, or we use horses to do this rather than we work with horses, or horses assist in a certain outcome, achieving a certain outcome. So there is still a proprietorial or an instrumentalization. But nonetheless, we are paying more attention to to animal welfare in AAI design. But still, there are a few references in the literature to taking that a little bit further to animal justice or to animal rights. But two notable contributions to AAI theory suggestive of animal welfare as something more than basic needs, and that apply the word rights were made within the last 5 years. And I'll just say quickly that one was Howie's 2015 Therapy Animal Bill of Rights, which centered really on the notion, quite a narrow notion of consent, expanding the basic idea of welfare, stipulating that workers ensure that mental and physical and psychological health by engaging therapy animals in activities that equate to self-care. So providing self-care to animals. Yes, and the other mention of rights is a similar provisioning in the recently revised Animal Assisted Intervention International Standards of Practice from 2019, where in there it signaled that the novel inclusion of the term rights in the phrase basic needs and rights of the dog, section 1, standards of practice. But again, that's really recent. And unless you're ensconced in this kind of research, I would say, and it would be hard to be aware of it. So while basically what I want to suggest is that while the term rights is very minimally having been introduced in AAI animal welfare discourse, and it may possibly shift conventional thinking about animals towards a greater appreciation of them as subjective beings that are entitled to recognition and protections, perhaps more than the basic welfare needs of, do they have enough food, do they have shelter, are they getting enough rest, but really a focus on their qualitative lived experiences. I would argue that this focus is quite limited to individual animals, or is limited to the individual animals who participate in animal-assisted interventions. So there's an absence, ultimately, of a collectivist animal justice thinking in the field. Next slide. So ethics and practice standards concerning animal participants are generally considered in human terms and human safety and liability. So for instance, when one participant told us that when dealing with assist type animals, the balance goes with the safety of the human. So according to a critical human geographer that I quite like, Simon Springer, they have written that human supremacy remains the principal way in which most human beings envision the world. So while a general awareness of anthroprivilege is already acutely known, actually reckoning with it is far from the minds of most people, end quote. So comparatively speaking, it may be said that AAI working animals do constitute in some ways a very privileged animal group, more readily the subject of people's sympathies, people's affections, effectively a kind of affective kinship due to their domestic proximity to people, right? And being engaged in these humanized activities. Genuine care and affection for individual animals, AAI companion animals, was mixed with ambiguity or difference regarding other animals. For example, most practitioners in the study did disclose that they eat meat and dairy. Study participants draw on individual relationships with animal companions and seek individual behavioral cues in themselves and their companion animals to inform their practice. Oh, sorry, that's something else. Okay, so there is this, if you could just go back for a minute. So it's just this contradiction that I think that the industry needs to grapple with. Okay, next slide. So the study found that the majority of AAI practice does not integrate a systemic animal rights or trans-species justice theory, notwithstanding the manifest anthropocentrism shaped by the limits of the human body and so on. The language used by study participants to articulate their experiences and perceptions of AAI is exclusive to companion animal species, and for the most part, anthropocentric. But notably, so there is very little distinction, if you will, between the professional lexicon that's used in AAI and the everyday vernacular for imagining and talking about animals. So while some study, and I think this is a really important point, there have been some studies that have looked at language, the language that is used to talk about different kinds of animals. But there are no studies, surprisingly, that look at language in the context of AAI. Our examination of the latent humanism and associated speciesism of dominant cultural discourse that informs the study data concludes that the presence of a degree of contradiction, or even, if you will, cognitive dissonance within AAI limits consideration of other animal difference, if you will. And this is not unlike how gender-specific pronouns have naturalized sort of essentialist models of identity. Anyway, so the view of companion animals as sentient partners in AAI was unanimous. That is not in question among study participants. But in relation to questions around animal justice, this perspective did not correspond to thinking about the treatment of other animals or of all animals. And I just want to conclude this particular thought because around borrowing from Barbara Herron, who is an anti-racist critical social worker at York University in Toronto, in her discussion around racism and privilege in critical social work, sort of that this type of contradiction signifies a place of double comfort, if you will. So that's of not naming our privilege in practice. So like Herron, who asserts we in critical social work must delve deeper into the processes of self-reflection and self-location, we argue that AAI practitioners must do the same and deconstruct one's anthropocentric positionality and human privilege that manifests rather as natural phenomena. So it's just looking at the contradictions in why some animals and not others. Okay, next. Yeah, so if you want to just go back for a minute. Yeah, so just a moment on those some of the quotes that I think are quite revealing on the slide. If we look at the first one, to have any sort of animal come in and fill that void, even for 5 minutes, then eat it. I don't know. There's a weird disconnect. Don't get me wrong. I still do eat animals from time to time. Second quote, I'm not prepared to give up my occasional hamburger because of concerns about cruelty to animals. Yet I'm still concerned about cruelty to animals. You know, it's that kind of hypocritical thing that a lot of people do. And thirdly, when I take on an animal, take a dog, has the intelligence of a 2-year-old, I have to be willing to be responsible for that animal for the rest of its life. The fact that it's labeled as property doesn't bother me because I'm going to be responsible for it anyway. My will covers their care. I think these quotes are very interesting. There's a lot being said in them, but just again I think I'd like to leave this particular part of the discussion with the thought that there's room in animal-assisted interventions to just to think about some of these contradictions. Okay. Go ahead. So Amberly, I'll turn it over to you for the next slide.
Amberly, you might be on mute.
Sorry, no, it's me. I saw there's one after that. So actually, sorry, I forgot this slide. So so we argue the integrity and future of animal-assisted interventions require that the ongoing efforts fostering consistency across professional terminology be guided by rigorous attention to the ideological underpinnings of that language and relations of AI. So that is to say, we need to think about the complex questions about animal identity and agency, and that we can't continue to practice within a humanist vacuum. And we'll turn it to the next slide.
And thanks for the reminder about the mute there, Anne. So what I'll say, and I know that we're getting dangerously close to lunch here, and everybody's being so generous with their time. So I'll keep these points brief, and I think that we'll have time to explore some of these in our discussions, and they'll also extend into the panel. So what I'll say is I would love to give you the first bit of the taste for it, and then if there's any more deep dive for later, then we're very excited to share, and there will be another paper forthcoming about some of these points. So what we really found, and what came out of this too, when we talk about the intuitive relationship that people had to their animal companions, was so much of that was facilitated by the settings and context in which AI was happening. So for quite a few participants, they would see their animal companions respond in a space to a client, to someone that might have shown up at their barn, to a chance when their dog might have been in the office, and they realize, wow, this is really quite profound. I've had this experience before. I was pursuing this before. And it's just really been, I can see now that this animal companion that is with me at this point would make a great working partner. And so there's some really neat pieces that came out of that. And I think, again, the quotes here kind of also talk about the inverse of that as well. And that when we also look at the spaces and contexts that are now kind of opening up with animal friendly, dog friendly places, before we have the policies and the knowledge in advance. And I think what AI practitioners do is really have to take on so much of that self-advocacy around these pieces, is seeing people that aren't knowledgeable about how animals interact. And as Melanie will talk about later on, with the kind of responsible pet ownership idea and responsible pet companionship, is that again, people get these certifications, or they think that their animals are really friendly because of different behaviors that they see, and they say, oh, this person will be, or this animal will be such a great therapy dog, or I can just take them wherever they want now because they have this certification, without actually thinking through these contexts and what what creates stress for these animals. So this leads into the next point, which I also found like deeply moving in our research too, is that, again, when practitioners are responsively and intuitively there for their companions, they can see when their companions are displaying stress in the work, and also understand what contexts make for stressful environments for them. So there was this really interesting literature review that came out years ago, and I think, again, with the textbook on animal-assisted interventions that Aubrey Fine continues to update every number of years, it is more talking about where these sensory overload issues are coming in for the animals. So either they're overwhelmed by people, there's different surfaces that they're walking on that could be painful or stressful, and then there's different odors or lotions or astringents that could also make the animal nauseous. And so there hasn't been a ton, again, of overarching regulatory ideas for this. There isn't one sheet that says what's going on. And I think within different training mechanisms, there are great guidelines for it. Like I know that anyone coming through St. John Ambulance, in their conversations, would always say that they made sure that there was only one dog that was on a floor at any time. But also having to be the personal advocate for that. So what did that mean as far as the extra kind of work that the AAI practitioner was doing as far as scouting out the area, making sure that they were communicating with the staff, communicating what the dog's comfort was, also building space for an animal to have personal space and the time for work. So these were all kind of the different things that we saw coming through that were incredibly empathetic, and also showed that there was so much room and kind of hunger for a relationship with the animal, but also how we need to respect animals' time off and their spaces in that. And so that leads into our last point too, around animal autonomy and where animals need autonomy in their practice. And I think we think about this too. And I mean, going right back to basics, which is one of the wonderful things about, I think, when we understand human animal relations as well, is how do we facilitate our own bathroom breaks and our own eating breaks when we are at work. And Kendra Coulter talks about this a lot with animals in labor, and that want to be part of a part of the job, but there's also the responsibility for us to see that, because the animals do, there's a companionship in that they do look to our cues, and that we need to be aware of their cues in it as well, and give them the space and time to do this. Oh, I'm sorry, and these are the next slides that we can go on to as well. Thank you. And so I think there's something really, really wonderful in that. And there were some really wonderful examples of big squashy blankets and kennels where a dog could take themselves in an office to say that they were done at the time. And that there was also big, in equine assisted therapy, there were big open pastures and choices for the horses to come toward clients as they felt fit. And so there were some really wonderful pieces that people were individually facilitating to honor their animal spaces in that, but to also be aware of where those continue to change and kind of how we're all anecdotally moving through that together and finding those pieces. So on the last slide here, and kind of the concluding piece, I just think these quotes again are really quite well. One of them is quite lovely, and the other one is tough, because it kind of talks again about that dissonance around that they're your responsibility. The dog can't do whatever they want. And I think this kind of comes back to the autonomy piece too, that yes, we have the dogs in the space, yes, they enjoy them, but then there are restrictions on, do we really, is the dog allowed to lick or groom whenever they want? Can they play how they want? Can they respond how they want or whine how they want, and is that distracting to the client in the situation? And so there's ambiguity in there too, I think, and kind of where the expectation of work and the essential dogness of being with a dog is also needing to be repressed in some of those ways to facilitate the therapy. But I also think that one of the great things we saw coming out of it was that AI practitioners are also very intuitive about speaking and knowing the discomfort of the animal. And I think that's one of the great things that we see, in that when they call it ventriloquizing, oh, the dog is feeling this. How do we work through, what could you do to support the dog feeling anxious? What do you do to do that? And by extension, helping people articulate their own feelings is all part of that exploration of autonomy, as well as that exploration of the therapy. So I think I'll leave it there for all of those pieces and the findings with it. And Cassandra, I think you're just wrapping up with kind of an acknowledgement of the study limitations, where we hope to go, and our thank yous before our discussion.
So just a quick few things about the study limitations. Essentially, it is anthropocentric insofar as the data collection it was limited to the provincial population and to the snowball method. And it focused on the human service provider experiences of those of AAI, inclusive of their interpretations of the experiences of the animals in practice. So one person said to us, now, does he know he's doing a lot of good? I don't know. I haven't asked him. But essentially, we at the same time, we recognize, as Witten, Zell, and Joy have argued, that there's some degree of anthropocentric orientation. It's inescapable simply by the fact of being human, that we perceive the world through the limitations of our bodies and our own cognitions. But we did endeavor to try to unpack the way that the representations of animal experiences as they were told to us by looking closely at the ways in which our language is also anthropocentric. And so trying to really dig a little bit deeper there. So in terms of future implications, next slide, and that brings us to the close. What I'd like to say, because there are all the practical pieces of conducting AAI, and I'm wearing my hat as a theoretician and thinking that in a world of global pandemics and acute climate crisis, we believe it's not overstated to suggest that AAI and its positive uptake of Zuia holds tremendous potential for the development of more sustainable health and mental health relations and care, because we know that one of the contributing factors to the kind of pandemic we're experiencing is, in fact, a zoonotic disease. So that's a transmissible disease between species, from animals to people and people to animals. So the question then becomes, how do we ethicize dyadic or one-on-one interspecies therapeutic relations? And we want to suggest that a creative, more than human vision of animal-assisted interventions, of animal-human relations, to advance the field of animal-assisted interventions that simultaneously recognizes human-animal interactions represent more than simply a complex structure of stewardship, and extends the core value that guides therapeutic work. So that's the respect of and dignity and worth of all persons, but that it's extended to all beings. And so with that, I do want to say thank you to all of you for listening to our findings of the research, and to thank all of the participants of the study. We had a slide though with their faces in it, didn't we? What happened to that slide? Anyway, I'm sorry, but that we had
I think I ended up just using all the lovely photos from all the animals.
Oh, I see. And we distributed
include yes. without anybody's direct face, other than our little tag for our friend that is at Mount St. Vincent University in Dalhousie.
Great, understood. Well, thank you. And thank you especially to the participants of the study. I know there was, again, this lag between the time that we met and we had those conversations to today. But as I say, I think that this in some way is a perfect timing because of I think the world is is more receptive to this work than it would have been even 5 years ago, say in Nova Scotia. And again, to Anne and the Nova Scotia community of social work for helping us present this topic today.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone. This has been so incredibly inspiring, impactful, and helpful to organize thought and feelings into a clear framework to guide us as we think about these issues moving forward. We are getting ready to have a lunch break. We will gather back at 1 p.m. and we will have a chance for discussion, small groups. There may also be like a chance for us to share questions and feedback. I know that the chat has been filling up, but I have not had a chance to look at the chat because I was sharing my screen. So I look forward to doing that as well. Meanwhile, I invite everyone to go stretch. Make sure that if you have any companion animals with you, that they go and stretch and give them some love and feed them as well as feeding yourselves. And I look forward to continuing our conversation at 1, and then we will also have our panel afterwards. So thank you both so much.
Yeah, so please do come back. I hope many of you can come back for the 1 hour breakout rooms. There we have some topics, but of course, if you want to talk about other things that came up for you, but it would be a really nice. My experience has been with this type of work that it often brings things to the surface for people, and so we'd love to hear from you and give you an opportunity to get together to share some ideas that may have come up as Amberly and I were speaking. And then for the afternoon panel, of course, we have some great speakers with us that bring a wealth of experience and real life applications of some of the more theoretical pieces that we were just listening to. So hope you come back to hear from our speakers as well.
Yes.
Thank you and have a great lunch.
Thank you. Have a great lunch. We will see you all back at 1 o'clock. We'll go into breakout rooms for about half an hour on different themes that came up, and then we'll gather back together to share some findings and ask some questions, because I know that everyone's probably super inspired to share thoughts, feelings, and questions. So go stretch, eat, and I will see you all very soon.